The Ghost in My Dreams, a scary story from Reddit. Subscribe to Scary Stories Vault for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. Alan had always been a rational man. An accountant by trade, his life revolved around order, numbers, and predictability. He wasn't the type to believe in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, and the paranormal were all things of fiction to him. But that was before the dreams began. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. At first, the dreams were fleeting, like faint whispers in the recesses of his mind. He would wake up with a vague sense of unease, the remnants of something unsettling clinging to his subconscious, but he could never quite remember the details. The feeling followed him into his day, a strange heaviness in his chest that he couldn't explain. One night, Alan awoke suddenly, his heart pounding in his chest, his sheets soaked with sweat. For the first time, he remembered a fragment of the dream. He had been standing in the middle of a fog-shrouded field. The air was thick and oppressive, and the world around him seemed devoid of life. She was young, no older than 17 or 18, and she stood several feet away, her long, dark hair hanging limply around her pale face. Her eyes, hollow and full of sorrow, bore into him. She wore a white dress, dirty and tattered at the edges, as though she had wandered through the wilderness for years. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. She was trying to speak to him, but her voice was lost in the thick, suffocating fog that surrounded them. Alan woke with a start. The image of the girl still burned into his mind. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the sense of dread that had settled over him. The dream felt too real, too vivid, as if it had been more than just a trick of his imagination. The next day at work, Alan tried to focus on his tasks, but the image of the girl haunted him. Her face appeared in his mind's eye at random intervals, her lips moving silently, as though still trying to tell him something. He told himself it was just a dream, a bizarre, unsettling dream, but nothing more. He had never been one to put stock in such things. But the dreams continued. Night after night, Alan found himself back in the foggy field, standing before the girl. Each time, she was a little closer, and each time her desperation seemed to grow. Her mouth moved frantically, but still no sound emerged. Alan began to dread, falling asleep, knowing that he would see her again. The dreams left him exhausted and on edge, his waking hours plagued by the ghostly image of the girl who seemed to be pleading for his help. It wasn't long before the dreams began to seep into his waking life. Alan would catch glimpses of the girl out of the corner of his eye, a fleeting shadow in the reflection of a window, a figure standing at the edge of his vision. But when he turned to look, she was gone. One night, as Alan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and willing sleep not to come, he heard it, a soft whisper. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was there. "Help me." Alan sat up abruptly, his heart pounding. He glanced around the room, but it was empty. He strained to listen, but the whisper was gone. Shaking, he got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the street was dark and still, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. There was no one there. The next night, the whisper came again, a little louder this time. "Help me." Alan bolted upright, his breath quickening. This was no longer just a dream. Something, or someone, was trying to reach him. The dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying. In one, the girl stood directly in front of him, her eyes wide and pleading. She reached out her hand, her mouth moving silently, but still, he couldn't understand her. The fog around them grew thicker, choking, suffocating. "Who are you?" Alan asked, his voice trembling. "What do you want?" The girl didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. Alan woke up gasping for breath, the image of her pale face lingering in the darkness of his bedroom. He couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a nightmare. Something was reaching out to him from beyond. Something was reaching out to him from beyond, something desperate and lost. Determined to find answers, Alan began researching. He combed through books on paranormal experiences, hauntings, and spirit communication. He read about how spirits, especially those with unresolved issues, might try to reach out to the living for help. The more he read, the more he became convinced that the girl in his dreams wasn't just a figment of his imagination. She was a ghost, and she needed his help to move on. Alan began keeping a journal of his dreams, hoping to uncover clues. He wrote down every detail he could remember about the girl, the fog, her appearance, her silent attempts to communicate. He started sleeping with a notebook by his bed, determined to document anything new that might help him understand what she wanted. One night, after weeks of restless sleep, Alan had the clearest dream yet. He found himself standing in the foggy field once more, but this time the girl was closer than ever. The girl was closer than ever. Her face was inches from his, her dark eyes wide and filled with despair. "Help me," she whispered, her voice finally breaking through the silence. Her words sent chills down Alan's spine. "I don't know how," Alan replied, his voice trembling. "I don't know what you want." The girl's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. "Find me," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. Alan jolted awake, his heart racing, the sensation of her cold hand still lingering on his skin. He sat up in bed, gasping for breath. He knew now that he had to find her, but how? What did she mean by "find me"? Was she buried somewhere, her body lost? Was she trying to tell him where she was, so she could finally be at peace? Determined to find answers, Alan began digging deeper into local history, searching for any clues about a young girl who might have gone missing or died under mysterious circumstances. He spent hours at the library, poring over old newspapers and records, hoping to find some mention of the girl who haunted his dreams. It wasn't long before he stumbled across an article that chilled him to the bone. The headline read, "Teenage girl found dead in nearby woods. Suspected foul play." The article was from nearly 20 years ago, detailing the tragic death of a 17-year-old girl named Leela. She had gone missing after leaving a friend's house one night, and her body had been discovered a week later in a wooded area just outside of town. The case had gone cold, with no leads or suspects, and her killer was never found. As Alan read the article, his blood ran cold. The description of Leela matched the girl from his dreams almost exactly. The same dark hair, the same hollow, sorrowful eyes. This was her. Leela was the girl who had been appearing in his dreams, begging for his help. Alan couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell him something about her death, something that had been missed all those years ago. But what? How could he help her now, after so much time had passed? The dreams continued, more intense than ever. Leela's presence grew stronger, her whispers more urgent. "Find me," she repeated, over and over. "Find the truth." One night, Leela appeared to Alan in his dream again, but this time the fog had cleared. Alan found himself standing in the very woods where her body had been found, the trees looming tall and dark around him. Leela stood before him, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes pleading. "You have to find the truth," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's still out there." Alan's heart raced. "Who?" he asked. "Who's still out there?" But Leela didn't answer. She simply pointed toward a distant tree, her hand trembling. Alan followed her gaze and saw something glinting in the moonlight, something half buried in the dirt at the base of the tree. When Alan woke up, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, he drove to the woods where Leela's body had been found. He hadn't been there before, but somehow the path felt familiar, as if he had walked it many times in his dreams. He made his way to the spot where Lila had pointed in his dream, his heart pounding in his chest. Sure enough, there, at the base of an old tree, something glinted in the dirt. Alan dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, the earth cold and damp beneath his fingers. After a few moments, he uncovered a small, rusted locket. His breath caught in his throat as he held the locket in his hands. It was old and tarnished, but when he pried it open, he found a faded photograph inside. A photograph of Lila. Alan's hands shook as he stared at the locket. This was what Lila had wanted him to find. But why? What was its significance? Determined to find out, Alan took the locket to the police, explaining what he had found and how it had been connected to the cold case of Lila's death. At first, the officers were skeptical, but after examining the locket and comparing it to evidence from the original investigation, they discovered something shocking. The locket had belonged to Lila, but it hadn't been found with her body. Instead, it had gone missing during the investigation, leading the police to believe that someone close to the crime had taken it, perhaps even her killer. With this new piece of evidence, the case was reopened and a new investigation began. It wasn't long before the police uncovered a series of leads that pointed to a man who had lived near the woods at the time of Lila's death. He had been questioned during the original investigation, but had never been considered a serious suspect. Now, with the new evidence, he was arrested and eventually confessed to the crime. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Lila's killer had been brought to justice. That night, Alan had one final dream. He found himself standing in the woods once more, but this time, the air was clear and the fog was gone. Lila stood before him, her face no longer gaunt and hollow. Instead, she looked peaceful, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and clear. Alan smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "You're free now," he said. Lila nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. And then, just like that, she was gone. Alan woke up the next morning, feeling lighter than he had in months. The weight that had been pressing down on him was gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace. Lila had moved on, and so had he. The haunting was over,